I generally find elders to be honest people. But I was preaching at a congregation, had afternoon service, and one elder came up to me and he said, "If you see me with my eyes closed, that's how I concentrate." Y'all didn't believe that. Didn't believe that for a second. It's 12:30. 12:45. You had a couple chicken legs. If you had some of that rice chicken casserole, like I had, threw in one of those amazing strawberry cupcakes on top of it with 3 of those no-bake oatmeal cookies that I eat before I get to my seat so I don't count them as dessert. You're probably getting pretty comfortable right there, aren't you? I can't do anything for you. I'm sorry. You're probably going to go to sleep. But I'm going to do the best that I can up here. Guy collected whisk. He loved whisk. That was his hobby. He collected them. Had a room full of them. Had hundreds of them. All had different handles. And some of them were big. Some of them were little. Some of them size that you could, the whole big vat of stuff. Some of them tiny. Whisk. He loved them. For some reason, the man just loved whisk. And he was at Williams-Sonoma. And they were having one of those shows where you listen to this big spiel about the pots and the pans. And then they give you a free gift. And he asked what the free gift was. And they said it was a whisk. And he said, "Well, I'm going to listen to this and get my free whisk." And so he's listening to it, and he's going to get his free whisk. And his wife comes up and says, "Hey, I'm ready to go." And he says, "Well, hold on a second. I got to finish listening to this thing and get my whisk." She said, "You don't need another whisk." She said, "You got hundreds of them. Come on, I'm not going to spend 15 minutes of my life listening to this spiel. We're not going to buy these pots and pans." He said, "Oh, I'm listening to get my free whisk." She said, "That is totally unnecessary. You do not need another whisk." He said, "I'm getting a whisk." So, sure enough, he stays. And he listen to the rest of it. He gets his free whisk. Oh, he's excited. He's got that free whisk. And he gets it. It's one of those cheap deals. Obviously not well made. It's free with the little pots and pans spiel. So he's walking out and he opens it up and the metal part flips up and hits him in the eye. See how cheap it is. And he trips over the curb. And a bus hits him. Moral of the story, don't take unnecessary whisk. That's the moral of the story. 1880. A guy by the name of George Waltzer decided he was going to do a social experiment. He decided he was going to prove to the world once and for all that atheism is the best strategy for life. That if you would spend your energy concentrating on this life and not waste your energy thinking about a future spiritual life, not waste your energy thinking about necessarily what's right and wrong, heaven, hell, God, the devil. If you would just concentrate on industry and how to build a city or town, and you would just focus on the here and now, then your life would be better. And he was going to prove that to the world, and that was his stated mission, to start a town where nobody believes in God and where it is the best social community in the world. And so he did that. At least he did part of it. He started a town where everybody there did not believe in God. In fact, that was the criteria for coming to be a charter member of this town. You could not believe in God, could not believe in the devil, could not believe in heaven, could not believe in hell. You couldn't believe in anything spiritual whatsoever. The name of the place is Liberal, Missouri. Liberal, Missouri started up based on those premises. You can go to Liberal, Missouri now. I was speaking at a place called Lamar, Missouri. It's about 45 minutes away from Liberal. These are the pictures I took myself. There you see the picture, Liberal, Missouri, population 779. I always think those population signs are pretty interesting. Did somebody move in last week? Did somebody move out last week? I always wonder when they put a population sign up there, how long that's been the population and what actually the current population is. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Population 779. You start looking at the city, town, street names, and as you see the street names, Walser Avenue for George Walser, who founded the city. Then you have Darwin Drive, named for Charles Darwin, of course. And if you were to look at that, you would have Paine Avenue. That's for Thomas Paine, who wrote a scathing attack on the Bible. Then you have Ingersoll Lane, that Ingersoll Lane for Robert Ingersoll, very famous agnostic infidel. So you can go and you can see all these street names, and you can see Liberal, Missouri. Now, when it was founded, it did not have a church of any kind whatsoever. And a man by the name of Clark Braden, member of the church, if I understand it right, he was a traveling debater and preacher. He wanted to see what Liberal was all about. And so he went to Liberal, and he walked through the streets, spent a little time there, wanted to see what was happening there. And he did see what was happening. And what he saw he wrote about in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. This is a copy of the exact article from 1885, I think it was. We called the county seat there. They had this on record, got a copy of the article, and he titles it, "An Infidel Experiment. The Colony of Liberal in this State, a Practical Experiment in Infidelity," which is what it was. It was an experiment to see if you don't believe in God, if your place is going to be a better place. So Clark Braden writes about what he sees. He says, here's what you're going to find if you go to Liberal, Missouri. All the hotels are prostitution houses. He said everybody drinks to the point of being drunk on a regular basis most all the time. He said everybody curses, all the women as well as the children and the men, they all curse. He said the place is a cesspool of immoral, terrible behavior. And the people would leave if they could, but their property value has sunk so low that they can't even sell their houses and they're stuck. And there's infidelity for you. Well, of course, the people in Liberal, Missouri didn't take that sitting down. In fact, one of the brothel owners, the hotel owners, decided he was going to sue Clark Braden for $25,000. And in 1885, $25,000 was a considerable amount of money. Come to find out, Clark Braden was so exactly accurate in his description of what was going on in the town that the case got thrown out of court, and the man who charged Clark Braden was charged with paying all of the court costs. Clark Braden never had to appear before any judge or any type of court system, and the other man had to pay everything. Why? Real simple. What Clark Braden was saying was exactly right. That's what was going on in Liberal, Missouri. It wasn't libel, it wasn't slander, it was a report of the fact. Here's what's interesting. George Waltzer, if you go to Liberal, Missouri, it's the oddest cemetery situation I've ever seen. It's in a big circle. It's about as big as this auditorium. And it's in a big circle. And there is a place reserved for George Waltzer to be buried right in the center. So if you were standing about in the middle of this auditorium, there would be a circular arrangement of all the graves of the people that lived in Liberal, Missouri. Except where George Waltzer was supposed to be buried is empty. Because after his infidel experiment, he realized, well, hold on just a second. I thought if people were atheists and acted like it, the place would be better. It wasn't. So I must have been wrong. So we kept looking. And as I understand it, he came in contact with the teachings of Jesus Christ and realized he had made a terrible mistake and did not want to be buried with all of the infidels that had died there in Liberal, Missouri. His place is empty in Liberal, Missouri, and he is buried some 45 minutes outside of Liberal, Missouri in Lamar, Missouri, the place where I did the seminar there, and noticed that he became a poet, lawyer, and philanthropist, and he passed away at Liberal, Missouri, but he was buried in Lamar. Now, as you start to look at that situation, you really do ask yourself the simple question, hey, what happens when a group of people act like they don't believe in God? What does that do to a society? And what I'm going to do for you is explain to you, show you from the atheists themselves what they admit would be the case if there's not a God. But before I do that, before we look at the fruits of atheism, I want to look at the fruits of Christianity very, very briefly. And here's what I mean by that. What would happen if people acted like Christians? Now, you and I both know. Somebody cuts you off in the middle of driving at 5:30 on a Friday. It's hard to act like a Christian, isn't it? Somebody somehow steals some money from you, does you wrong in a business deal. Hard to act like a Christian. We don't always get acting like Jesus taught us to act right, do we? And so what I'm saying here is not what would happen if you acted perfectly like a Christian. But what I am saying is, suppose that everybody did what Jesus asked them to do, as much as they could. Suppose that you lived in a place where people did to others what they wanted done to them. Suppose that you lived in a place like Paul wrote in the book of Philippians, have this mind in you which was also in Christ Jesus. What mind is that? Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem others better than himself. Let each one of you look out not only for his own interest, but also for the interest of others. What if we were kind-hearted and treated each other like brothers, forgiving one another, just as Christ Jesus also forgave us. What would that be like? Would you want to live in a congregation? Would you want to be a part of a congregation where people acted like Jesus taught them to act? Sure. Would you want to live in a society where your neighbor did to you what you wanted done to you and you did vice versa? Is that where you want to live? Absolutely. So as you start looking at some people who were behaving like Christians, this is from, notice, Bertrand Russell, who was one of the most outspoken adversaries of Christianity in the Bible. He wrote an article titled, "Why I'm Not a Christian." He's not a fan of Christianity in any shape, form, or fashion. But here's what he says happens when Christianity took over the Roman Empire. He said Christianity conquered the state, put it into the gladiatorial shows, not because they were cruel, but because they were idolatrous. The result was to diminish widespread education and cruelty. Christianity also did much to soften the lot of slaves. It established charity on a large scale, inaugurated hospitals. Although the great majority of Christians failed lamentably in Christian charity, the ideal remained alive, and in every age inspired some notable saints in a new form, passed over modern liberalism, and remains the inspiration behind much that is most hopeful in our somber world. What happens when Christians act like Christians? Well, they have an impact on their whole society. They establish charity on a large scale. They put in hospitals. In fact, Christianity, he says, is the inspiration behind much that is most hopeful in our somber world. Now, what happens when people act like they don't believe in God and they put that into practice? Well, I'm going to show you what is admitted by people who don't believe in God. This is a quote from a Darwin Day address by William Provine. William Provine was an atheistic biologist, and he wrote, "Naturalistic evolution has clear consequences that Darwin understood perfect." He said, number one, no God's worth having exists. Number two, no life after death exists. And number three, no ultimate foundation for ethics exists, no ultimate meaning in life, and human free will is non-existent. Now, I don't have time to go through all of those. Those last three, that no foundation for ethics, no meaning in life, and no human free will. Those three ideas are attached to the concept of atheism. You can't get around it. If there's no God, you are here not because you were designed, not because there's any purpose in your life, but you're here by blind, random chance processes. Morality does not really exist. It's just something you like or dislike. And it can be different for everyone because, hey, after all, and we'll get into this, you don't consider a dog to be immoral for stealing a bone from another dog. If you're just a higher level of an animal, then you don't have a moral compass or a moral standard either. And ultimately, none of your actions matter at all. And really, if there's nothing supernatural and you don't really even have a soul, then it's not you making the decisions anyway. You just have atoms banging around in your brain that are driving you to do things. Now, what happens when, we're just going to deal with one of these, what happens when we look at that idea that there is no ultimate foundation for ethics? What's it mean? You can't say what's right or wrong. There's no standard for that. There's no foundation for that. If there's no God, as Dostoevsky wrote in his book, Brothers Karamazov, all things are permissible. You can't say one thing's right or wrong. You can say you don't like it. You can say it doesn't benefit society. You can't say it's wrong. And I'll show you how that works. Charles Darwin said, a man who has no assured and ever-present belief in the existence of a personal God, or the future existence with retribution and reward, can have for his rule of life, as far as I can see, only to follow those impulses and instincts which are the strongest or which seem the best ones to him. He says, look, if you're just an animal, and you don't think that there's a heaven and you don't think there's a hell, do you know what your mode of operation is, your life mode of operation? If it feels good, do it. Just follow those instincts and impulses which are the strongest to you. All right, you're in the line downstairs and chicken legs, your favorite thing in the world to eat, right? And it's you and one other person. You're kind of in the back 3/4 of the line downstairs and there's one chicken leg left. And boy, it's a juicy looking big one. And you're starving. You've been waiting in that line for the last 12 minutes. Seemed like an hour and a half. And you see that person right in front of you go for that chicken leg. And in your mind, you're thinking, I want that chicken leg myself. And you look around and you realize you're bigger. You're bigger and you want that chicken leg. And right then, at that moment, the instinct that is the strongest to you is to punch that person in the face and take that chicken leg. What's stopping you? Let's say you do that. You see that person grab that chicken leg, you walk, punch him, take it. And they say, well, I was here first. That's the instinct and impulse that seemed the strongest to me. What do you think about that? Well, there's nothing that anybody can say if there's no God. You can't say, well, that's wrong. Wrong why? Wrong how? Who says? You don't see us condemning a dog for stealing a chicken leg from its fellow dog, and if you're just a higher mammal, then that's all you're doing. Now, understand this. Listen to me. Don't take my word for this. Who made that statement? Charles Darwin. We're not putting words into their mouth here. This is what they're admitting to be the case. Now, if you were to go to Psalm 14:1, most of the time we stop at Psalm 14:1. We do the same with Romans 1:20. The reading was very well done. I appreciate that. If you look at the rest of Romans 1 or the rest of Psalm 14, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Now, what's it say next? They are corrupt. They have done abominable things. There is none who does good, no, not one. Well, then if you look in Romans chapter 1, it says these people suppress the truth of God in unrighteousness. You then look at the list of unrighteous things that they do. They are haters of parents, murderers, revilers, sexually immoral. It goes down the whole list. What are the Bible writers trying to tell you? When you get rid of the idea of God, it opens the door to every type of immoral behavior. Every type. Because there's no standard to appeal to say, you can't do that because. Now here's where you get real morality. There's only one place to get it. There is a standard in the nature of God that you say, this should not be done because it doesn't accord with God's righteous, holy nature. Why don't you lie? Because God doesn't lie, and His nature is such that lying is a bad idea. Why don't you murder? Because God's nature is such that wanton murder by a human being is wrong. Why don't you commit adultery? Because God's nature provides the standard. If you get God's nature out of the picture, what happens? There's no standard. I'll show you what I mean by no standard. Dan Barker says, there are no actions in and of themselves that are always absolutely right or wrong. It depends on the context. You can't name an action that's always absolutely right or wrong. I can think of an exception in every case. Okay, at first that might not sound that insane, but let's think through that. He made this statement in a 2005 debate with Peter Payne. Peter Payne was arguing that without God, there's no moral standard, and Dan Barker was basically saying, yeah, you're right. You don't need one. In fact, he said, you can't think of an action that's always right or wrong. I can think of an exception in every case. Student, most of the time these debates are on college campuses because that's where the real battle for these types of discussions is going on in a lot of cases. A student came up to the microphone to ask the question. He said, okay, Dan Barker, atheist, he's the co-president of Freedom from Religion Foundation. He said, can you think of a time when it would be right to rape a person? Good question. If no action in and of itself is right or wrong, well, Barker said, yeah, I can. He said, it's hypothetical. A lot of this stuff is so improbable it wouldn't happen. But he said, if aliens somehow came down and said, oh, we're going to kill all of human society, every human, if you didn't do this to a person, then yeah, it would be the right thing to do. So I knew he'd made that statement in 2005. So in my debate with him in 2009, I said, Dan, do you still believe that? He said, yeah. I said, well, what about 2 people? He said, yeah. I said, what about 2,000? He said, yeah. I said, what about 2 million? He said, it would be my moral obligation to do that to 2 million people if it would save humanity. Then I read him a quote from a Nazi German who was killing Jews, who said, I am doing this to save humanity. Now, once you throw out the idea of God and His nature being the standard, it really boils down to whatever you think is the best thing at the time. And that's what Charles Darwin was trying to say, and that's what Dan Barker was saying. Now, it's interesting to me that as Dan Barker was saying this, he recognized that the people in the audience, most of whom were Christians, were appalled at his statement, and he looked out at the audience. There was about 550 people in the venue at the time, and probably 450 of them were members of the church, and they were just flabbergasted. What I thought naively back in 2009 was, if I got Dan Barker to admit to something like this, then his atheistic community would pull themselves away from him. Because if a man stands up and says that that would be your moral obligation, I thought somehow that will drop him faster than a hot potato. That should be the end of his career. No, not at all. In fact, he looked out at the audience and he saw how appalled they were, and he looked over at me and he said, "But you would thank me, because I'd be saving your life." And here's the problem with the atheistic proposition. Atheism says this life is all you got. And so they value physical life over everything else. And I said, no, I'd never thank you for doing something like that, because I know when I die, I've got somewhere better to go than this life. And he said, you don't know that. And I said, yes, I do. Because here's the fact. If you know there's somewhere better than this life, then physical life is not the ultimate end-all. There's something better, and there's something more valuable, and that's why Jesus Christ gives His physical life on the cross, because He knows there's something better. But if you don't believe in the supernatural, if you don't believe in the soul, if you don't believe that there is a God, if you don't believe in a heaven or a hell, there's nothing better for you. And so you protect your physical life at all costs, whether you have to cheat, whether you have to steal, whether you have to rape, whether you have to murder, doesn't matter. It's all about this physical life. You see the problem with that? If it's all about this physical life, and you end yourself up in Liberal, Missouri, and you see that your buddy leaves his brand new horse tied out front, and nobody knows that you can take it and your physical life can be better, you go steal that horse because that's the instinct, the impulse that seems the strongest to you at the time, and you put him in your barn, and you play like you've never seen what happened to the horse and must have just run off, because your physical life you think is now better. See the problem with that? Just no moral standard. Now, I'll let you read what they have to say about this. As you start looking at this idea of abortion, killing an unborn child, no possible way you could ever go to the Bible and come away with the thinking that that would be something that would be all right. In fact, there in Proverbs chapter 6, the Bible says these 6 things the Lord hates, yes, 7 are abomination to Him. One of the things that God hates, the shedding of innocent blood. What more innocent blood is there than the innocent blood of an unborn child that cannot protect itself in any way? That relies on the human society and its parents to protect it. There's no more innocent blood. In fact, as you look throughout the course of the entirety of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, a child is viewed as a child from the point of conception. Not from the point of birth, not from the point of 8 days after conception or a month after conception, from the point of conception. Do you understand that the same word that is used to describe John the Baptist in utero, when he does a little flip turn when Mary comes and he realizes that the mother of his Lord is there and he's in utero, the same word used to describe John the Baptist in utero is the word that's used to describe Jesus lying in the manger. Jesus' ex utero has already been born. John the Baptizer's in utero hadn't been born yet. And the same word describes both of them, talking about them as a child. Conception always has been the point of humanhood in God's eyes and from the biblical standard. Now, since 1973, Roe v. Wade, we have killed upwards of 55 million babies in the United States of America. 55 million. We've only got 330 million people in the whole United States. We've killed 1/7 of our population since 1973. To the tune of, when the Twin Towers fell that day, 2,450 people approximately were killed in that act of terror. President George Bush, you remember that? Got on international television, told everybody we were going to hunt these terrorists down. We were going to make sure they paid the price for what they did. Oh, that day in the United States, we killed 2,400 babies. legally. The day before that, we killed 2,400. The day after that, we killed 2,400. We've been killing 2,500 of our own citizens every single day since 1973. Now, where do you get the idea that that'd be all right? That's a perfectly acceptable way to do things. Well, you don't get it from the Bible. You don't get it from Christianity. Where could you get it? I can show you exactly where you could get it. Charles Darwin said there's really no fundamental difference between man and the higher mammals in their mental faculties. Okay, so you're just an animal. Well, what do you do to animals? Chickens, cows, sheep, etc. Well, you kill them on a regular basis. This is a statement by Barbara Burke in Infanticide in Science. Here's what she said. Among some animal species, infant killing appears to be a natural practice. Could it be natural for humans too? A trait inherited from our primate ancestors? I mean, after all, Charles Darwin noted in The Sin of Man that infanticide has been probably the most important of all checks on population growth throughout most of human history. My parents years ago, we used to do some coon hunting. My dad bought a coon dog, a real expensive coon dog, and I think her name was Queen. She was going to have puppies, and they were going to be worth about $1,000 a piece. First litter she had 12 puppies. Ate them all but one. Next litter, she had 8 puppies. She ate them all but one. She thought she could only take care of one puppy at a time. Did she do something morally wrong? That dog who thought she could only take care of one puppy at a time. It's not like we sent her to jail. It's not like we prosecuted her. You don't prosecute a dog who eats its puppies because that's an animal. It's just not moral value there. And what's Barbara Burke saying? Well, if according to Charles Darwin, you're just a higher animal and you feel like you can't take care of children or a child that you're going to have, hey, they kill theirs. So why don't we just kill ours? You see the problem, once you throw God out. Now listen, we quoted this earlier, the Declaration of Independence, the first beginning statement. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among those life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. What happens when you get rid of the Creator? If all men are endowed with these rights by their Creator, but you don't recognize or acknowledge the Creator, then what do you lose with that? You lose all human rights. In fact, the babies lose all their rights because, hey, they're just animals. The adults lose all their rights because they are too. And so you forfeit all basic human rights when you get rid of the idea of God. Now, there again, you don't have to take my word for that. As we continue, here's what Peter Singer says. If we compare a severely defective human infant with a non-human animal, dog or pig, for example, we'll often find the non-human to have superior capacities. Only the fact that the defective infant is a member of the species Homo sapiens. Now stop right there. He's getting it kind of complicated. He says there's really only one reason we keep this human alive. Why? It's a human. In the past, we've always kept humans alive because they're humans, because they are members of the species Homo sapiens. Species membership alone, however, is not morally relevant. Let me tell you who Peter Singer is. Peter Singer is supposedly the world's foremost ethicist, a person who can explain to us what's right and wrong. Richard Dawkins, in a video with Peter Singer, says to Peter Singer, this guy, you're the most moral person I've ever met. Supposedly, Peter Singer is supposed to be the paragon of morality in the atheistic community. And here's what he says. You know, if you got a dog or a pig, and this dog or pig is going to be valuable to society, and you got a Homo sapien over here, a human, in the past, we looked at this defective human, and we looked at the dog, and we said, well, if we got to keep one of them alive, well, we'll just keep the human. And the answer to why was because it's human. He says, but now let's get rid of that idea of species membership and ask, which one of these is going to be most valuable? And he continues, if we can put aside the obsolete and erroneous notion of the sanctity of all human life, we might start to look at human life like it really is. And what do you mean by that? Nevertheless, the main point is clear. Killing a disabled infant is not morally equivalent to killing a person. Very often it's not wrong at all. Oh, you just keep these little organisms alive because we call them humans. Now why? Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. The divine community had a meeting and they said, let us now make man in our own image according to our likeness. And that's exactly what they did. There's a reason, historically, we have always favored the species Homo sapiens. It's not because we happen to have evolved and we're trying to keep our genetic material passed along. That's not why. The reason we have historically favored humans is because humans are the only entity on God's green earth that is made in the image and likeness of God. And that's why in Genesis chapter 9, after the flood, when God tells Noah, you can eat all of the animals that are out there, but you can't eat humans. You can't murder humans because they are made in the image and likeness of God. Now, here's what's exciting about that. Here's what's thrilling about that. You're not a fast runner. Who cares? You're still valuable because you're made in God's image. You're not really good looking on the outside. You're not real pretty. You're not real handsome. Who cares? You're still valuable to God. You're not smart. You don't do math very quickly. You're still valuable. Why are you valuable? Because God made you in His image. Doesn't matter how fast you can run. Doesn't matter what you score on tests. Doesn't matter if you're going to be able to benefit society. You're worth something. But now get rid of the idea of God. You get rid of the idea of God and stuff starts boiling down to, well, what are you going to do for society? Society going to have to spend money on you, or are you going to be a burden to society? That's going to determine whether or not we should keep you. You see the problem there? Continue with me. James Rachel said, an infant with severe brain damage, even if it survives for many years, it may never learn to speak and its mental powers may never rise above a primitive level. In fact, its psychological capacities may be markedly inferior to those of a typical rhesus monkey. In that case, moral individualism would see no reason to prefer its life over the monkey's. You got a monkey, it's probably going to be smarter than this defective human infant. So why keep it over the monkey? Let me read for you one of the most appalling, ridiculous statements I've ever heard. This man, if I understand it right, had a PhD, taught at the University of Alabama. Here's what he says in his book. Now notice, Created from Animals, The Moral Implications of Darwinism. Now, before I go further, let's analyze this statement. What's an implication? An implication is something you know to be true, whether or not it's written out, stated for you. And here's what I mean. If you have information that leads to other information that's implied, it's not like it's less true, it's just not written out for you. Explicit information is written out. Implied information is just as true, you just have to reason to it. So I'll give you an implication in the Bible. In the book of Revelation, it says that heaven, the holy city, it says that the gates are never shut by day. And there is no night there. Okay? Real easy to understand. The gates are never shut by day, and there's no night. When are the gates to heaven shut? Never. Now, it doesn't say the gates to heaven are never shut. It says they're never shut by day, and there's no night. So what's the implication? They're never shut. Now, never shut is not written out. It's implied, but it's still just as true as they're open by day, they're not shut by night, therefore they're never shut. Okay, an implication is a true statement that follows from information you've got. Now here's the information you've got according to Rachel's. We're really evolved animals, and that's it. So what's the implication to that? He's going to tell you. Some unfortunate humans, perhaps because they've suffered brain damage, they're not rational agents. What are we to say about them? Well, the natural conclusion, according to the doctrine we're considering, would be that their status is that of mere animals, and perhaps we should go on to conclude that they may be used as non-human animals are used, as laboratory subjects or as food. Are you starting to see what's happening here? Look, we don't even have to say anything as creationists and Christians. We can just let them say it. You would think that they would have almost the fear of outright stating the implications of atheism. that they would try to hide this implication. Okay, yeah, they might know that if there's no God, it implies that you're just an animal and you don't really have a soul or a spirit, and you could, but surely they're not going to state it. But they do. And that is exactly why the fool said in his heart, there's no God. They are corrupt. They have done abominable things. There's none who does good, no, not one. Now, somebody's going to stop me right there and they're going to say, hold on just a second. I know a guy who's an unbeliever. I know a guy who's an atheist, and he is a highly moral individual. He would never do anything like this. Okay, I understand. I know a person who calls himself a Christian and he's a highly immoral individual. So what are we saying with that? We're not saying that everybody who calls himself a Christian is moral, and we're not saying that everybody who calls himself an atheist acts like atheism leads you to act. We're saying that the teachings and philosophies at their core imply these ideas. That the idea of God implies human sanctity of life and a moral standard. That the idea of no God implies no sanctity for human life and absolutely no moral standard. And you don't have to take my word for that. That is an implication that the atheistic community admits with no apology. And this is where it leads. Several years ago, I think it was 2006, a man by the name of Dr. Eric Pianka. He was voted the Texas Scientist of the Year. Very prestigious because in Texas, there are a large number of science educators. Dr. Eric Pianka stood in front of the 2006 400 of the most prestigious scientists in the state that year and was delivering his acceptance speech for his award of the Distinguished Texas Science Educator of the Year. Before he stood up, he went to the person who was filming and told him not to film what he was about to say. The man behind the camera pointed the camera up at the ceiling and shut it off. Dr. Pianka studies reptiles for a living. It's what he does, and when he stood up in front of these 400 and some odd science educators, he explained that there is one species of organism that is taking over the planet and ruining it for every other species. For reptiles, for fish, destruction of habitat, etc. And he said that species is the Homo sapien species. He said humans are the bane of planet Earth. And we need to eliminate 90% of them. And when asked what he thought would be a good idea as to how to do that, he said an airborne Ebola virus would be a great candidate to kill a large number of people. It would run its course in 3 or 4 days, and then it would be gone, and we could eliminate 90% of the human population. What you'd like to think is that those science educators listened to that ridiculous, immoral, horrible, add any word you want to that, and were disgusted and appalled and walked out and revolted against that idea. They didn't. They stood in unison and gave Eric Pianka a standing ovation for saying we need to kill 9 out of 10 people. They asked him later, are you going to be one of the 9 out of 10? You know, it's a good question, isn't it? Because it seems that this arrow, generally speaking, from the atheist community points outward, not inward. If you get rid of the idea of God, then you jettison all human value. Now, let's take it from the idea of Christianity. Humans from the beginning chose incorrectly. They were created in the image and likeness of God. They were endowed with an immortal soul. That immortal soul will be an entity that lasts longer than any nation, longer than any physical entity. The immortal soul that you have right now will continue for eternity. It will go on and on and on. In fact, it's more valuable than any natural resources, than all the natural resources of earth combined. What shall a man give in exchange for his soul? What if a man gains the whole world, everything, and loses his own soul? One man and his soul, one woman, her soul, is worth more than all the combined natural resources in the entire universe. Now let's see the value of a single human soul. And I'm convinced with all my heart that this is the case. That if Kyle Butt were the only person in the entirety of the human history of the world who had sinned, then Jesus Christ, the treasure of heaven, would still have come down, lived a perfect sinless life, and suffered unspeakable pain on the cross to buy back my soul. You see, according to atheism, if there's no God, human life is expendable. Treat people like animals or food. But looking at Christ on the cross makes that impossible, doesn't it? Because Christ accentuates the value of every single person. And He says to you through His actions and through His word, I love you so much that I will not sit by and let you trip through your life into an eternity and be lost. You're too valuable to me. In fact, you're so valuable, it doesn't matter how pretty you are, it doesn't matter what your hair looks like, it doesn't matter how fast you run, it doesn't matter what you score on a standardized test, it doesn't matter if you got a nice new truck, that doesn't matter to me. You matter to me. In fact, you matter so much that I will die for you. You see, the difference between atheism and Christianity is that atheism says humans aren't valuable. Christianity says you're so valuable, God will empty heaven of its most precious jewel to try to keep your soul in a loving, saved relationship with Him. And so the question comes to you this afternoon, are you in that relationship? You know, there are some people who say they believe in God, but they don't act like it. They say they believe that there's an eternal destruction, but they don't live like it. They just keep doing what they want to do, and they don't take time to stop and ask themselves the question, if I've got an immortal soul, where's mine going to go? You've got one. It's a fact. And the question is, where is your immortal soul going to go? Have you responded in obedient faith to become a Christian? If you haven't, now's the time as we stand and as we sing.